Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to journey back into one of the most misunderstood and terrifying chapters of Western history. It is a story not of mythical monsters, but of ordinary neighbors turning against one another. We are exploring the great witch hunts that swept through Europe and early America. This is not a tale of magic, but a story of fear, faith, and the tragic consequences when panic overrides reason. To understand how this happened, we first have to leave behind our modern world of science and logic and step into the mind of a person living in Europe 600 years ago. Imagine a world without electricity, where the dark of night was absolute and filled with strange sounds. Life was incredibly fragile. Crops could fail overnight due to a strange frost, a healthy child could be taken by a sudden fever, and the milk from the family cow could sour for no apparent reason. For the people of the medieval and early modern periods, these were not just random misfortunes. Their world was a battleground between the forces of God and the devil, and every calamity was a potential strike from a malevolent, supernatural source. The devil was not a metaphor, he was a real, personal entity who prowled the world, seeking the ruin of souls and the destruction of their daily lives. This belief in harmful magic, which scholars often call maleficium, had existed for centuries. The village healer, the old woman who knew which herbs could cure a cough, also knew which plants could poison a troublesome neighbor, or so it was believed. People whispered of curses that could make a man impotent, a woman barren, or cause a hailstorm to flatten a single farmer's field while leaving his neighbors untouched. This was the everyday fear of the common person. However, for a long time, the Church's official position was that these beliefs were pagan superstitions. To believe that a peasant woman had the power to control the weather was, in itself, a sin against the doctrine of divine providence. The night ride through the sky, the wild gatherings in the forest, these were illusions sent by the devil to trick the foolish, not events that actually happened. The real danger, the Church warned, was in believing you had that power, not in the power itself. But this perspective was about to change in the most devastating way. The shift from viewing witchcraft as a simple superstition to defining it as a direct, organized, and heretical conspiracy against the Christian world was the first crucial step toward the horrors that would follow. The air in Europe grew tense in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Black Death had wiped out millions, wars seemed endless, and religious anxieties festered. The stability of the old feudal and church order felt shaky. It was in this atmosphere of crisis that the intellectual framework for the witch hunts was truly forged. Church authorities began to connect the scattered folk beliefs of village magic into a single, diabolical conspiracy. They took the old fears of the harmful spell and fused them with the high crime of heresy, the deliberate rejection of the Church's teachings. Witchcraft was no longer just about harming a neighbor's property, it was now about making a formal pact with Satan himself. This imagined crime required a demonic initiation, a renunciation of Christ, and a gathering of secret followers. The idea of the witches' Sabbath was born, a dark, orgiastic assembly where witches flew through the air to mock the Christian Mass, trample the cross, and engage in unspeakable acts with the devil. This was a fantastically evil inversion of everything good and holy, a conspiracy theory of cosmic proportions. Then, in 1486, a book was published that weaponized this new theory in a way the world had never seen. Its title was the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the Hammer of Witches. Written by a German Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer, it was a comprehensive manual for the identification, interrogation, and extermination of witches. The book made a deeply influential and devastating argument. It claimed that not believing in the reality of witchcraft was itself a heresy. Most damningly, it was obsessively fixated on women. The very word maleficarum is feminine, and the text explodes with a virulent hatred of the female sex, portraying women as intellectually weak, spiritually defective, and insatiably lustful creatures, making them easy prey for the devil's seductions. Thanks to the recent invention of the printing press, Kramer's twisted manifesto spread across Europe with unprecedented speed. It became a bestseller, second only to the Bible in popularity for a time. The Malleus provided a pseudoscientific and theological justification for torture. It explained how a judge could legally mislead a suspect with promises of mercy to gain a confession, how to strip a woman and search her body for any mark or blemish that could be a devil's mark, an area insensitive to pain. Because it was believed the devil controlled the witch, every denial of guilt was not seen as innocence, but as proof of Satan's iron grip. Kramer's work codified a paranoid logic where every plea of innocence was a lie and every crack in the floorboard was a portal to hell. It transformed a scattered fear into a standardized, legal procedure for mass execution. With the Malleus Maleficarum as a guide, the machinery of a witch trial followed a terrifyingly predictable pattern across different lands. It almost always began in the same way, not with a dramatic bolt of lightning, but with the slow drip of communal resentment. Imagine a small, tightly knit village. A farmer's crops are failing. He remembers that last week, he had an argument with an old widow over a boundary line, and she muttered something under her breath. A month later, his child falls ill with a mysterious shaking sickness. He connects the two events in his mind. He shares his suspicion with his wife, then a neighbor. The neighbor adds that her butter hasn't been churning properly ever since the same woman asked to borrow some milk. A local death, a sudden storm, a deformed birth in the livestock, all these misfortunes are now retrospectively attributed to the supposed witch's malevolence. The woman, often socially isolated, poor, and with a sharp tongue, has no idea that a mountain of suspicion is slowly being built against her from the mundane tragedies of daily life. This is the accumulation of public fear, what was known as infamia, and it was enough for a local magistrate to take notice. Once the accusation was formalized, the accused was brought in for questioning, and the script of the courtroom was itself a psychological trap. The process was designed to produce a confession, not to uncover the truth. The questioning didn't focus on if she did it, but how and when. The judges would ask incredibly leading questions, using the narrative from the Malleus as a script. They would describe the Sabbath in lurid detail and demand to know how many times she had been there, who she had danced with, what demon's name she knew. A simple denial was useless. If she said she didn't cause the storm that destroyed the barn, her interrogators would insist the devil was clouding her memory or making her mute. The only proof the court would accept was a full, detailed confession. This created a horrifying paradox. The system held the power of life and death, and its only escape route was a confession, but a confession guaranteed death. The goal was to peel away her reality and replace it with their demonological narrative. To be accused was to enter a world where your identity was erased and rebuilt by your accusers into the image of a monster they already believed you to be. The physical and psychological assault was about to turn an innocent woman's life into a living nightmare from which there was no earthly escape. When the verbal pressures of questioning failed, the European legal system turned to a tool that it believed was sanctioned by both God and law: torture. We must understand that in the early modern period, torture was not viewed as an arbitrary act of sadism, but as a legitimate and logical method of judicial investigation. A confession was considered the queen of proofs, and if a person would not provide it willingly, the court had a duty to break down their resistance. The legal theory was that physical suffering would force the devil to loosen his grip on the woman's tongue, freeing her to speak the truth and save her soul, even as her body was being destroyed. The instruments were designed to terrorize first, and destroy second. Often, the process began with being stripped and shaved, a dehumanizing search for the devil's mark, a spot on the body that felt no pain. This search itself, with all its probing violation, was a form of psychological torture. If no mark was found, or if the woman still refused to confess, the interrogator would walk her to the chamber and explain the function of each device. The physical agony was catastrophic and systematically applied. The strappado involved tying her hands behind her back and hoisting her into the air by a pulley, dislocating her shoulders. The thumbscrew crushed fingers and toes into pulp. Leg vices, lined with spikes, tightened around shins until bone splintered. The rack stretched the body until joints were ripped from their sockets. In this crucible of agony, the leading questions continued. To make the pain stop, the accused would often agree to anything the inquisitor said. But the system was not satisfied with a simple yes. They required a narrative, a full story with names and places. A victim would gasp out a name of a neighbor, someone she saw in the market, perhaps a face that appeared in her delirium. That named person would then be arrested the next day, and the cycle would begin anew. This is how a single accusation could multiply into a mass panic. The confession, once given under duress, had to be repeated freely outside the torture chamber to be legally valid. If, in the cold light of day, she recanted, she was simply taken back to the chamber, not to be re-tortured, but to have the previous torture continued. It was a perfect, airtight system of persecution. The only final relief was the stake. The witch hunts in continental Europe were not a single event but a series of rolling, explosive panics that peaked between roughly 1560 and 1630. This was a period of immense societal stress. The Reformation had shattered the religious unity of Christendom, leading to brutal religious wars between Catholics and Protestants that devastated the German lands and France. In this climate of apocalyptic fear, both sides saw the devil's work everywhere, and identifying and eliminating his earthly servants became a terrifying priority. The stereotype of the isolated crone as the primary victim holds true in many areas, but what made the Great European Panic so uniquely horrifying was that the accusations spiraled completely out of control and began to consume entire communities. They became chain reaction hunts where no one was safe. The confessions extracted under torture became more and more fantastical, incorporating not just the murder of a neighbor's child, but diabolical conspiracies to destroy entire harvests and overthrow God's kingdom. Some of these panics stand out for their sheer scale and savagery. In the small German territory of Würzburg, under the rule of Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, a man so zealous he was called the witch bishop, a frenzy between 1626 and 1631 claimed over 900 lives. The victims included his own nephew, 19 priests, and scores of children, all forced to confess they had danced at the Sabbath. The logic of the hunt dictated that if a high-born person was accused by a dozen tortured beggars, it had to be the truth. Why else would so many independent witnesses say the same thing? Similarly, in the city of Bamberg, a special witch house was built to hold the overflowing prisons, complete with its own built-in torture chambers. The Bishop of Bamberg himself financed the hunts with the confiscated wealth of his victims. In the electorate of Trier, whole villages were so depopulated by the burnings that the first visitor of a new magistrate was a man who reported he could find no one to carry out the executions. The panic in the Basque country of Spain, investigated by the skeptical inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias, is another striking case. He heard thousands of confessions from children and adults of secret gatherings, only to find not a shred of physical evidence. His famous report, which argued that no witch had been proven to exist, stands as a rare beacon of reason that slowly helped pull Spain back from the brink decades before the rest of Europe. The witch hunts in England had a distinctly different character from the continental mass panics. The English legal system was more centralized and professionalized, and crucially, it strictly forbade the use of torture without a direct warrant from the king or Privy Council. This single legal difference saved thousands of lives. Without the rack or the strappado to force a cascading chain of confessions, English witchcraft cases rarely exploded into the demographic catastrophes seen in Germany. The accusations tended to remain localized and targeted. The English witch was less the diabolical servant of a cosmic, apocalyptic conspiracy and more the troublesome village malcontent. The focus of English law, codified in a 1604 Act under King James I, was on the crime of maleficium, the act of causing harm by magical means, more than the pure heresy of a satanic pact. The typical case involved a beggar woman being turned away from a door, muttering a curse, and then a sudden illness or death in the household. The evidence was neighborly testimony and the search for a witch's mark, or a familiar, a demonic pet in the form of a cat, toad, or small dog that the witch was believed to nurse with her own blood. However, England also gave rise to a case that was an alarming exception, driven not by village squabbles but by high politics, and overseen by a man with a professional obsession with witches. In the early 1640s, during the chaos of the English Civil War, a Puritan lawyer named Matthew Hopkins emerged in the eastern county of Essex. Declaring himself the Witchfinder General, he launched a reign of terror that was unprecedented in English history. Hopkins was a master of psychological torture. Since physical torture was illegal, he used sleep deprivation, forced walking for days, and a method called watching, where the accused was tied cross-legged on a stool for 24 hours without food or water, watched by guards who would prick her skin looking for an insensitive spot. His most infamous test was the swimming of a witch. He would bind the accused right thumb to her left big toe and throw her into a river. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned in the process. If she floated, the pure water was seen to have rejected her corrupted body, and she was guilty. Hopkins and his associate John Stern operated like a traveling business, selling their services to terrified towns. In just over 2 years, they were directly responsible for the deaths of over 100 people, a figure that accounts for more than half of all witchcraft executions in England's entire history. His short, brutal career shows how easily even a system with legal safeguards could be overwhelmed by a charismatic and unaccountable professional hunter. The transatlantic story of the witch hunts finds its most concentrated and tragic expression in a small colonial village on the coast of Massachusetts. The settlement of Salem in 1692 was a community under severe pressure. It was a world of extreme Puritan piety, carved from a dark and threatening wilderness they believed was the devil's territory. The constant threat of attack from French colonists and their Native American allies during King William's War had created a refugee crisis, with displaced families pouring into Salem, putting a strain on resources. Political uncertainty was rampant, as the colony's charter had just been restored and its identity was in flux. Deep, festering family rivalries over land boundaries, grazing rights, and church influence had long since split the village of Salem, a farming community, from the more prosperous and mercantile Salem town. The spiritual pressure was immense. Their minister, Samuel Parris, preached a constant sermon of doom, division, and the imminent betrayal of God from within the very community. It was a powder keg of anxiety, waiting for a single spark. That spark was struck not in the fields or the courts, but in the parsonage kitchen. During the long, dark winter of 1692, a group of young girls and teenagers, led by Parris's 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, began to experiment with the occult future-telling. They listened to the stories of Tituba, an enslaved woman in the household whose cultural background from the Caribbean included folklore about magic, omens, and evil spirits. The girls attempted to divine their future husbands' professions by dropping an egg white into a glass of water and interpreting the shapes, a bit of harmless fortune-telling to modern eyes, but a dangerous gateway to Satan in the Puritan world. Soon after, the girls began to display terrifying symptoms. They screamed uncontrollably, crawled on the floor barking like dogs, threw Bibles across the room, and contorted their bodies into impossible positions. A local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, diagnosed them with being under an evil hand. The supernatural diagnosis was now official. The adults crowded around, demanding names. Who was tormenting you? Under this intense pressure, the girls, now the center of a terrified and attentive adult world, gave the names of 3 women who fit the perfect stereotype of the witch: Tituba, the enslaved woman; Sarah Good, a pipe-smoking homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman involved in a scandalous property dispute. The trap was sprung. Once the first 3 names were given, the machinery of Puritan justice began to turn, and what happened next transformed a local accusation into a full-blown historical catastrophe. The fate of the Salem panic hinged on a unique and devastating piece of evidence allowed by the court: spectral evidence. This was testimony from an accuser that the spirit or specter of the accused had come to them in their dreams or visions to torment them, even while their physical body was supposedly elsewhere. The logic was simple and terrifying: the devil could only use a person's shape with their permission, so if a girl saw the specter of a farmer stabbing her with a pin, that farmer must be a witch. This testimony was unprovable and undisprovable. It existed only in the accuser's mind, visible only to them in a public fit of hysteria in the packed meeting-house courtroom. The girls became the star witnesses, the legal seers into an invisible world of evil. When Tituba, perhaps to save her own life or under brutal coercion, confessed in vivid detail to signing the Devil's Book and seeing the names of the other 2 women in it, she validated the entire courtroom's belief system. The panic then exploded exponentially. The net of accusation widened wildly, shattering the typical pattern of accusing only the marginalized. The girls, now wielding immense social power, began to point fingers at those their families and the factional leaders around them had long-standing grievances against. They accused pillars of the community: Rebecca Nurse, a frail and pious great-grandmother; Martha Corey, a well-respected church member who had publicly expressed doubt about the accuser's credibility. These were not the poor outsiders of the village, these were the godly, the landowners, the powerful. To doubt the accusers was to become one of the accused. When the girls screamed and writhed in court, claiming a specter was biting them, the accused could only watch in horror, as their denials were literally drowned out by chaos. The legal trap snapped shut. A confession, as in Europe, was the only way to avoid the noose. Those who lied and confessed, weaving wild tales of riding on broomsticks and signing the Devil's Book, were kept alive as witnesses. Those who maintained their innocence with quiet dignity, like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, were convicted on spectral testimony and condemned. The governor's own wife was eventually named, which was the final shock that began to break the fever. By the time the panic subsided in the autumn, 19 people had been hanged on a barren hill called Gallows Hill. One man over 80 years old had been pressed to death with stones for refusing to enter a plea, and at least 5 more had perished in jail. As suddenly as the flames of the witch hunts had erupted across Europe, they began to flicker and die down. The end was not a dramatic overthrow of a belief in magic, but a slow, grinding collapse of the legal and social systems that had made the prosecutions possible. A new intellectual climate, the early Enlightenment, was blowing a chilling wind of doubt across the continent. Thinkers began to fundamentally question the use of torture, not just because it was cruel, but because it was unreliable. The airtight logic began to crumble when people asked the simple, devastating question: what kind of truth is produced by the strappado and the rack? If a person would confess to anything to stop the pain, then a confession was no longer the certain queen of proofs. It was a desperate scream for mercy. The chain reaction panics of Germany had also been so total that they effectively destroyed themselves. When a prince-bishop's own family members were being led to the stake, the social elite realized that no amount of power or piety could protect them. The fear of being accused finally outweighed the fear of witches. In Massachusetts, the end came in the form of intellectual and theological backlash, spurred by the very real horror of what had been done. The Salem trials had been a shock to the system. The key turning point was the moral courage of voices like the Reverend Increase Mather. He was the president of Harvard College and one of the most influential ministers in New England. While he believed in witches in theory, he was horrified by the court's reliance on spectral evidence. He famously argued that it would be better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. His powerful phrase, that it was a damning error to mistake the devil's illusion for a person's guilt, pulled the intellectual rug out from under the trials. His writings, circulated in the colony, directly influenced Governor William Phips, who had finally been shocked into action after his own wife was named. In October of 1692, Phips dissolved the special court. He forbade any further arrests and then, in a decisive blow, he declared that spectral evidence was no longer admissible in a court of law. Without the testimony of specters, there were no more cases. The remaining prisoners were eventually pardoned and released. The hanging stopped. The extraordinary episode in Salem, lasting barely a year, had burned itself out, leaving a landscape scarred by grief, guilt, and a profound sense of communal shame that would linger for generations. The story of the European and American witch hunts is a deeply complex and tragic one. Historians now estimate that the prosecutions claimed between 40 and 50,000 lives across 3 centuries. The geographic and demographic portrait is nuanced. While the stereotype is the female witch, and overall, roughly 75 to 80% of victims were women, in some regions, like Normandy in France, Iceland, and parts of Russia, the majority of those accused were actually men. The hunts were not a monolithic, medieval outburst of superstition, they were, in fact, a largely early modern phenomenon, powered by the new anxieties of a changing world, the spread of information through the printing press, and the consolidation of state legal power. It was a perfect storm where a theological idea of a diabolical conspiracy fused with village-level grudges and was then prosecuted using a rationalized, bureaucratic system of law that allowed for judicial torture. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the witch hunts is not about witchcraft at all, but about the terrifying power of a self-sealing belief system. The legal process of the witch trial created a perfect trap, a closed loop where every plea of innocence was a lie and the only escape was to die confessing a lie. It was a systematic process of dehumanization that allowed communities to destroy their own members with a clean conscience, believing they were doing God's work. This story serves as a dark mirror, reflecting our own contemporary moments of mass panic and social contagion. The patterns of the hunt, the identification of an internal enemy, the weaving of unverifiable conspiracy theories, the social pressure to conform and accuse, the punishment of dissenters as sympathizers with the evil, these are not relics of a superstitious past. They are recurring dangers of any human society under pressure. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the darkness. If this story of how fear can override reason resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe. And think about this. The witch hunts didn't end because people stopped believing in the devil, but because they stopped legally empowering one person to point to another and scream, "I saw her in my dream." I'll see you on the next one.